this is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. It's the basis of the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on October 5, 2025. It's part of our series called Built on Grace, Being Known and Loved. So I'll be reading from the New American Standard Bible and its 2020 revision, beginning at Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. Jesus is speaking, and he said, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. When he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and to those he said, 'You go into the vineyard also, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. And he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour and did the same thing. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, 'Why have you been standing here idle all day long?' And they said to him, 'Because no one hired us.' And he said to them, 'You go into the vineyard too.' Now when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the laborers and pay them their wages, starting with the last group to the first.' When those hired about the 11th hour came, each received a denarius. And so when those hired first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. So when they received it, they grumbled at the landowner, saying, 'Those who were hired last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day's work in the scorching heat?' But he answered and said to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. But I want to give to this last person the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I want with what is my own? Or is your eye envious, because I am generous? So the last shall be first, and the first last." We're going to look at this story in 3 different parts. We'll begin looking at this parable in verses 1 to 7, and then we'll move on to look at verses 8 to 10, and then finally 11 to 16. So let's look at these first 7 verses about every last one. Now, Jesus' parable of the laborers in the vineyard may not be aptly titled. The focus here should be on the generous vineyard owner, not just on the workers who came at various stages of the day. Jesus tells this parable following a question from Peter in Matthew chapter 19, verse 27, about how he and the other disciples should be viewed since they gave all to the mission of Jesus. So Jesus ends the lesson with Peter about how the first will be last and the last first. And then he tells this parable. So Jesus sets the stage carefully, and we should not read past the words here. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner. The focus here is on the landowner and the virtue he has. This landowner arose early to hire laborers for his vineyard. So the working day would typically begin at 6 a.m. and it would conclude at 6 p.m. So it's a 12-hour workday. So he is there to hire people before 6 a.m. After they agreed to the normal standard wage for a day of labor, he sent them into his vineyard. He then went out at 9 a.m., 3 hours later, to hire more workers, and he says, "Whatever is right, I'll pay you." They likely assumed they would get less than a day's wage since they only worked 3/4 of a day. The vineyard owner goes out and gets more workers at the 6th hour, which is noon, at the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m., Well, why in the world does he keep going back to hire more laborers? Well, the implied part of the story that nothing is explicitly said about it is that whatever's going on at this vineyard, it's urgent work that would require the vineyard owner going out and hiring people all day long to try to get people to come do the work. So we might miss this if we're not careful with the story, that the story only works because there's this urgency that's driving what's going on, that the owner of the vineyard keeps going out all day long and hires people. Now, Jesus' listeners would obviously get it. They would understand the fact that the owner keeps going out to hire means that whatever's happening needs to be dealt with right now. The work needs to be done immediately. But what's most odd in the story is that the owner goes out at the 11th hour, which is 5 p.m., to hire workers for only 1 hour. Now, what's different here is the owner asks a question. He asks those who've been standing there at 5 p.m., why have you been standing here all day? And one might ask, why did the owner not see them standing there before? Well, their answer gives us the opening key to this parable. They respond to the question by saying, no one hired us. They are the rejected, the discarded. They're the last to be picked for the team. And in keeping with Matthew's gospel, these likely represent tax collectors and sinners. There's no place for them since they were overlooked and rejected. So they say, no one hired us. To them, the owner says that they're to go to work as well in his vineyard. There's nothing said about what they will be paid, only go, and again, the kind of urgency of whatever is happening at this vineyard. And that opens a key passageway to us, that God includes all in the urgent work of the kingdom. God includes all in the urgent work of the kingdom. Underlying the parable is the subtext of urgency. Why would an owner go back 5 times to hire people? Whatever is happening, it's pressing, and that's what we need to learn here about the work of the kingdom, that the work of the kingdom is pressing. Penetrating the world with the gospel is urgent work. But this story is less about mission and more about our place in God's mission. Those who come to faith first are not better than those who come to faith last. God's value of grace is to engage as many as possible. The work is urgent and pressing. So the axiom here is that the more the better. But that's not just the only lesson here for us. There are more. So let's move on to verses 8 through 10. As we look at the middle of this parable, we see a generosity revealed in verses 8 to 10. This parable already has some unusual features. Why is the vineyard owner hiring so many people? Why is the owner hiring people for just 1 hour before quitting time? All these issues are really a means to an end in the parable. Parables are stories told by Jesus that use language and settings that were completely in context for those who heard him. But what Jesus often uses in these parables is a tool called hyperbole. And it is a deliberate exaggeration of what's going on in the story to almost being unrealistic in order to make his point. So hyperbole is exaggeration, but it's exaggeration designed to bring emphasis to something. So we shouldn't overlook it easily. Now, as the story unfolds in verse 8, the owner calls his foreman with the instruction of gathering the laborers to be paid. Now, note the order. Those who arrived last, those are the ones who are going to be paid first. And here's the big moment in the story. So the people who arrived at the 11th hour, 5 p.m., they get a denarius. At this point, there is no problem in the story. Now, perhaps people are wondering what's going on, but there's no problem yet. The other laborers might be wondering, why is the owner so generous? And at the same time, you might imagine that the ones who had been there longer, now they have bigger expectations, thinking, well, if the people who are here an hour got a denarius, we're certainly going to get paid more. So don't lose sight of the fact that the 1 hour people are being paid as the others watch. It's not a secret. It's designed to be public. Verse 10 tells us that those who were hired at 6 a.m., they got the same. They got exactly what was promised to them. But you see, they now expected more. All we have so far is, to be honest, a crazy vineyard owner who pays everyone the same, no matter how long they worked. And it does open a key passageway to us that we need to focus on. That God's generosity is unfair and unbalanced. Good. God's generosity is unfair and unbalanced. Good. Now, what happens in the parable is shocking to those who heard it. People who worked an hour got paid the same as those who worked all day. You see, what Jesus is lifting up here is that this God, the vineyard owner, is generous, that the economy of the kingdom of God is generous. There are many interpretations to what this might mean. Are the people who worked an hour tax collectors and sinners? Are they the Gentiles? Are they people who've been in the church community a long time versus those who've only been in the community for a short amount of time? To be honest, don't get really lost in those details. The axiom or the truth here is the same, that generosity is the key in the kingdom of God. And we're about to learn why. We turn now to the last few verses, verses 11 to 16, about this generosity that's now being reviled. Now, as the parable moves towards its ending, we get to the moral of the story Jesus is telling. When those who started working at 6 a.m. get their denarius, it says they grumbled. That word for grumble, it's the only time it occurs in the Gospel of Matthew. They're grumbling and complaining. Verse 12 is the clear and direct source of their complaint. And it's this, that those hired last only worked 1 hour. So the issue they have is disparity, that how is it they're being paid the same for 1 hour of work as those of us who worked for 12 hours? And then they say, you have made them equal to us. Are there not echoes here from the book of Genesis between Cain and Abel, between even Adam and Eve, about being equal to us? And especially another story Jesus tells in Luke's gospel, the story of the prodigal. There's a complaint about others being made equal to us. And then the third thing they say is that we bore the burden of the day's work and heat. And so their attitude now is one of comparison, that our work was better than somebody else's work. And it's also that of entitlement, that we worked longer, so we're entitled to more. So the case of those who worked all day is simple. This isn't fair. There it is. Fairness. You see, the response of the owner in the parable is a response to Peter's question he asked right before this parable. The owner of the vineyard says to the ones who worked all day, look, I'm doing you no wrong. You agreed to the wage I was going to pay you, which was the denarius, and nothing is being taken away from that. They're getting exactly what was promised. And then the vineyard owner says, is it not lawful for me to do with what is my own? The analogy in this parable runs deep, that if the vineyard owner is God, at least in a symbolic fashion, and so the reward is God's alone to give. That in some ways, everyone is equal to God, so God gives the same reward to everybody. You see, the values that are happening in this story through grace is different than greed. Greed is grounded in many ways in fairness. You see, grace values who is there, not how they got there. And so the rebuke Jesus uses in this parable by the vineyard owner is hard. The vineyard owner says to those who worked all day after they've grumbled and complained, the vineyard owner says, take what is yours and go. It's so dismissive in the language. It's like almost a rejection of those who worked all day. The owner is insistent in being more generous to those who worked and arrived last. And then he asks this rhetorical question, is your eye envious because I am generous? Such a powerful question here, that do the workers get to decide who the owner should and should not be generous to? Or maybe even more directly, they feel that they should get a measure of generosity that's equal to those who worked only for 1 hour. They felt that they should have been given the same generosity as others. So what they have taken for granted is that they actually had jobs to begin with. They've taken for granted that they were included. They have taken for granted that they've lost nothing, that they were paid exactly what they were promised to be paid. But what they want is more generosity than others. It was about how they compared. Now, Jesus then says that the last shall be first and the first last. Makes sense. Not fair, but it makes sense. And our closing key passageway then is this, is that we are the recipients of grace, not arbiters of it. We are the recipients of grace, not arbiters of it. Humans are quick to judgment. This parable is a good illustration. If this parable played out today, it would go down exactly the same way. We believe that our standard of ill-informed fairness is actually right and good. So this parable is a confrontation and a harsh indictment of how we make the grace of God something else. What we must seek here is that everyone receives grace, not that some deserve it more than others. That's not grace. So we must be looking for the last. Why? Well, if we read the parable clearly enough, because God is out looking for the last, and God is going to be generous to them. And so we should be looking for them too. A quick word about Passages. This podcast, that it has moved to a new podcast host on the FFMC podcast. So I want to encourage you to please subscribe to the FFMC podcast using your favorite podcasting app. Under the FFMC podcast, you'll find not only Passages, but you'll also find our Sunday sermons, and you'll also find our new monthly podcast called Connections. We're going to be terminating this podcast, Passages, on its separate feed very soon. So please do migrate to the FFMC podcast right away. I also want to encourage you to visit our church's website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.